leaders just want the headline. So the lesson for them is, really ask, why am I being told this? Is there a counter argument here? What am I not hearing? What is this person not telling me? That's their responsibility, not to just take whatever they're told because it's easy and it suits their preference or their preconceived notion, which is in many cases exactly what they're doing.
That was Nuala Walsh. I'm Ben Morton, and this is your podcast. The Ben Morton Leadership Podcast is your weekly show where I bring you inspiring interviews with global thought leaders, MDs, and CEOs. Sometimes there'll be big names from big brands, and other times there'll be everyday leaders from organisations that you've never heard of. No matter what the case, two things will always be true. In every episode, there will be something that you can learn and immediately apply to help you be an even better leader. And number two, it will always be a free resource as my gift to you to help you on your leadership journey. In today's episode, we are looking at how to make good decisions in a noisy world with Nuala Walsh. Nuala is an award-winning non-executive director, behavioural scientist, TEDx speaker and author. She was named among the 100 most influential women in finance and spent 3 decades in investment management at Blackrock, Merrill, Lynch and Standard Life Aberdeen as Chief Marketing Officer. And as for me, well, I'm a leadership trainer, keynote speaker and executive coach. 11 years into my third career. The first was 10 years in the British Army with multiple deployments to Iraq. My second career was working for some of Europe's largest organisations in HR and L&D roles before founding Ben Morton Leadership back in 2013. So between myself and Nuala, you're in great hands if you want to be an even better leader. There is so much for you to take away from today's episode, but here are a few of the highlights and things that you can expect to learn. What is the missing critical step in your current decision-making strategies, and how can you put that missing step in place? We're going to look at uncovering some of your blind, deaf, and dumb spots. That might trigger you, but those spots are there for you, for sure. We're exploring the risks and dangers of saying things like, just give me the headlines. We also look at why every business problem is actually a behavioural and human problem. And we're also touching on how to choose the right voices to tune into and listen to. And if you're listening to this in the UK as this episode airs, it is incredibly timely because we are in the immediate run-up to a general election. And in an age where there is so much misinformation and disinformation, how can we choose the right voices to tune into? Well, Nuala is about to give us some critical guidance on that very topic. That is it by way of an introduction. So let's dive straight in and please enjoy my interview with Nuala Walsh. Nuala, before we get into talking about your new book, Tune In, which I'm absolutely loving, by the way, can you start off by telling me and my listeners about your first memorable leadership experience? Now, that could be one for you personally, some leadership you was on sort of the receiving end of, and how that experience went on to shape you and what impact that had on you, please.
Sure, Ben. Well, it's funny, when you ask that question, the first thing that springs to mind is actually my first leader. Now, I've been in business over 30 years, so I've seen the spectrum, the good and the bad. But the first manager that I ever had, I was in a consulting firm, PA Consulting in Dublin. And his lesson was to always go the extra mile for clients. Now, it sounds really simple, but if a client pays for A, B, C, you give them D, E, and F for free. So it was just basically the principle of adding value. And I guess it's the first thing that stuck with me. And I did it for the rest of my career. I guess in some respects, I think for some of my bosses, I gave them DEFGHIK all the way to Z. I gave them far too much, usually for free. But it was a lesson. It was a lesson that in terms of just going the extra mile for people and giving them a surprise on the upside, if you like. And just because if somebody orders ABC, even if you're in business, customer, you expect that. You don't expect people to go to do more than what they've paid for or asked for. And I think that's the value add. So I always remember him for that. I'll jump to my last experience, which was, I guess, was negative, which was, I guess I learned quite late the cost of politics and maybe not listening to the wrong voices and only, hearing whatever we wanted to hear or not really reading between the lines. And I think that default to truth and trust, and it's a naivety in some respects. I think maybe it didn't shape my career because I realized it and spotted it a little late, but maybe it did lead me in some respects, to write this book, because it is all about listening to certain voices and not being politically naive and being, behaviorally smart, I guess.
Yeah, and that's a lovely lead-in, which wasn't actually deliberately planned, but I've got a copy of your new book here, Tune In. Now, I guess it could be very easy for someone to pick up this book and go, tune in, there's a little dial on the front cover. That's all about listening. But it's not, is it? Like, I'm only a couple of chapters in, but for someone to pick it up and think it's a book about listening would be a mistake, right?
I'm very glad you spotted that and you deduced that, because it absolutely isn't about listening. It's about interpretation. So we all know we have to listen. We know that. So this is about going the second order. It is reinterpreting whatever you hear. So whereas listening might be the first step, it's about interpretation, which is the neglected step between listening and decision making, if you like. And I think that's sort of the neglected area that I think that people don't often consider, because, we're in a fast, noisy world where we don't have time to slow down and interpret. We hear something or we listen to somebody and then we just jump to conclusions. But in actual fact, even to your point about listening, even when you want to listen to somebody, there's so much noise out there. There are so many voices out there. You don't know which one to listen to. Never mind then get on to interpretation and decision making. So in actual fact, even when you want to, you only process about 25% of whatever you hear anyway. And then the memory effect is you forget half of that a couple of minutes later anyway. So the challenge for really good, consistent decision making is quite hard in this current world. So you're absolutely right. It's definitely not about listening per se.
And so I guess in many ways, this is the $1 million question, right? So when so many of us do find ourselves living and working in a really noisy world, and by that we mean, right, there's a lot of data, a lot of information, lots of sound bites, just so much coming at us. It can be hard to sort of cut through that, right? So like, how do we do it? Like, what are some of the most basic things we can do to try and cut through that noise when there are so many things and people competing for our attention?
I guess the first thing to is at least appreciate the fact that you are doing that. And the problem is that most people don't even realize that that's what they're doing. So most people already think that they are tuned in, if you like, and that they have the right information. So you point out that it's hard to cut through. It is, but I think we underestimate the context that we operate in, and because of all of that noise, we automatically trigger out. So the first thing you have to do is at least understand why it's happening, and that is a bulk of the book, to explain to people why it's happening. And it's not just because there's too much information, or it's a polarized world, or it's a fast-paced world. That's half of it. But then the context interacts with, how we think, our cognition. And that's where the whole idea of all of these traps that we can fall into that we are not typically aware of starts. So before you get into which voice do you listen to, I think the first step is, it's like a doctor. You have to understand why you are at risk and why you can go wrong in your decision making. And that's the luxury of, I guess, this model that I've suggested. It helps people prevent error by thinking about it in advance. And then if you have made a mistake, you can at least diagnose it by applying this model and saying, okay, did I do X, Y, Z here? And what are the real reasons? And then you can jump to a whole set of solutions and different practical tools in terms of how you do it. And I've added at least 24 practical ways of cutting through the noise. But I do say that the first thing is to at least slow down so that you tune in selectively and strategically. I mean, you know well that a lot of people talk about you have to listen to every voice, and practically and from a neuroscience perspective, you can't listen to every voice, and every voice isn't equal in a given situation. So it is about slowing down at least so that you can at least pause to consider who you're listening to and where you might be at risk.
I love the fact you said slowing down there, Nuala. And I think that is a real challenge, I think, for many leaders in my experience. And for whatever reason, maybe this in itself is a consequence of the world we live in and perhaps how we've sort of come to become conditioned, certainly in the business world. But I see it so many times where leaders feel they can't slow down. They feel almost as if every decision has to be made straight away, instantly. If they're not making quick, instant decisions, then they don't have any value, or they're not a good leader, or they're not credible. But interesting to hear your view on this in a minute. But like, I just don't think that's the case. And regular listeners to my podcast have probably heard me talk about this before, but I remember as I was finishing up my training in the army and I was doing my sort of infantry training before I went and took command of soldiers, my instructor, who's an exchange officer from the Australian Army, said, all right, guys, when the time comes when you are deployed overseas and there are bullets literally hitting the dirt and the dust in front of you, he said, first thing to do is obviously take cover, like get somewhere where you're safe. He said, after that, and I'll shortcut this, but he went through this long story, a very deliberately long story of basically telling us the next thing to do is get out a water bottle, drink half the contents, half a litre of water, stick it away, and then make our plan or whatever. But basically, he was teaching us to slow down, to pause before acting. And I often reflect on this, and I don't say this as a criticism or trying to be particularly flippant, but I think if in that situation, if we can pause and take a few minutes before deciding, surely we can do that in most situations in business, because it's rare in business that lives are on the line in a matter of minutes based on our decision. Like, what's your take on that? Like, whether we can slow down, how we can do it, and that sort of thing.
Well, it's very interesting that you start that, because most people will say exactly as you say. Well, the first point is that we're conditioned, and we are conditioned because organization structures and systems basically reward fast decision making. There's a Harvard Business Review that shows, it's a 10-year review actually of, I think it was 17,000 people, that showed that you were 12 times more likely to become a CEO if you make faster, earlier decisions than someone who doesn't. Now, that just says, it doesn't say accurate. I didn't read the word accurate in there. It was just quicker decisions. And we know it. I mean, we do live in this fast-paced world where it's, instant meals, instant rewards, instant weight loss, instant everything. And we don't have that. But I absolutely agree with you that we're conditioned for that. But if you actually want to make better decisions, and if you want to, take out your own insurance policy against error, and accept the fact that, right, you've been successful up to now, but, and on that rock you shall perish, as plenty of people have shown, it is possible to do it. And the people who say it isn't, it would start with where you are, well, you're on the battlefield, or you're a fireman and you can't pause, or you're in surgery on the operating theatre. Now, I know that you can't pause and go for coffee, but at the end of the day, as exactly as you say, you can pause, because there are other studies that show that even a 3-second pause in thinking, it does slow you down. Now, it's not a lot, but actually, if I was silent here for 3 seconds, it would be a bit awkward. Your editor would be cutting me out because it would feel really long. So it is long enough to at least pause and think, what do I think about X?
Hey there, excuse the interruption in my own podcast, but you've just heard Nuala and myself talking there about the difference between quick and effective decisions. If this has resonated with you, then do drop me a line and we can have a chat about my keynote talk, Why Human Connection is the True Currency of Leadership. In that talk, I'll take you and your people back to a specific moment in 2003 when I had to make a very quick decision and asked two soldiers to potentially lay down their lives in the most heinous way imaginable. I'll talk about how we can create the conditions where people follow us because they want to, not just because they have to. Do drop me a line and we can chat some more. For now, though, back to the episode.
And there are firemen I don't know if you remember I think it was called In the Red Skies of Montana. There was a chap called Wagner Dodge. And anyway, and they made a film of it where he was a fireman and there were 15 they're called stormtroopers.
Right.
And anyway, the fire was coming his way fast and he didn't have time. And he set fire to the ground around him so that it burned so that the main fire would go over him and form a shelter to some extent. Anyway, the long and short of it is, that was a high pressure decision that required, instant thinking, off the cuff and out of the box thinking. So in those situations, he didn't have much time, but he had some time, and it wasn't long. You might have been on a couple of minutes in that scenario. So he didn't have too much time, but it is possible to do it. And the science says that if you'd use those 3 seconds, that it does make a difference. And there are other studies in hospitals that show the same, that the surgeons who don't just rush to their instinct based on however many years experience they have, that if they pause and then double check, that the accuracy level, it actually goes up by 30% rather than just rushing to judgment. But it is much harder now, but being hard doesn't mean it's impossible. It is a conscious step, and the consequences of not doing it are far more severe than the consequences of just slowing down a little. But that's not to say it's easy. It's possible. But I think, as you say, it starts with a conscious decision that actually you want to be more responsible. And if you do hold a position of power, it's unbelievably important, because the consequences, it's not just you and your reputation, it's the impact on other people. And we don't always think of that when we're in a hurry. We typically think of ourselves. But, if you look around you, it can be your family, your clients, your customers, your employees. All the decisions we make have consequences, and we're too busy to think about it and evidence the whole premise of the book, which is human error is rising, and it is. And people are feeling more and more unheard because we're so busy. We don't get the chance to firstly tune in and then reinterpret what people are saying. So it is a bit of a crisis. Not wishing to be negative, but it kind of is.
Yeah, no, I get that. I see that. I sense that. I think you're absolutely right. I do think there, in many respects, is a sort of attention crisis, a crisis around our ability to make good decisions and actually tune in to what matters. Right? I agree. Yeah. In the book, Nuala, you mentioned two things that really piqued my interest, and it's the first one is a twist on a common used phrase, right? We all talk about blind spots, certainly in terms of leadership development. For years, people have been talking about what are your blind spots, but you've flipped that round, right? And they're talking about deaf spots. What do you mean by deaf spots, please?
You're absolutely right. I think most of us, get the idea of blind spots, the inability or unwillingness, if you like, to perceive a problem or a fact or whatever. But deaf spots are less known, but equally powerful. And I deliberately use deaf spots. Obviously, it tied in with being tuned out, but it has its roots in that we hear what we want, we mishear, and we don't hear what really matters. And it's rooted in science very clearly. There is a concept of deaf ear syndrome, which is exactly that. And there are quite a spate of biases that support it, whether it's, I'll give the most obvious one, is the ostrich effect, where we literally put our heads in the sand and don't listen to people, whether it's about medical advice or, parental advice or feedback or whatever. And then I suppose you could use the romantic example where we hear what we want when we're told, and how many of us have fallen for those sweet lines over time. But then in business, there's another one that touches on that naivety that maybe I pointed to earlier, which is a default to truth. We automatically believe what we're told. We don't think bad things happen. And that mixes with something that's called the just world hypothesis, which is we believe that good people get rewarded. You work hard, you'll get your pay rise or your bonus or a promotion. And, bad people, the underperformers in a work context, or people on the battlefield in your case, get punished. So there is that view, and it is an incorrect view, because that's exactly what it says. We believe in a just world, and that can lead us astray as well, because I guess it means you're not really looking for hidden agendas and motivated reasoning and others. So that's another, and it is it is what you're listening. You're not reinterpreting what someone's telling you. You're just taking it at face value and moving on. And there are many examples of people who have done that and got it wrong. So that's why I wanted to focus on deaf spots. But I didn't want to ignore dumb spots, because they are blind, deaf, and dumb spots. And dumb spots are very current because they relate to the inability or unwillingness to speak up. So you might self-silence. You might hear about a wrongdoing and decide that you're a bystander in that scenario. And many people do. But when you choose to self-silence, other people can't hear your voices. So by definition, it's a dumb spot, because no one can hear whatever opinion you have. And of course, there's a degree of severity there as well. So all three actually have been form what I've called the trilogy of error, which is blind, deaf, and dumb spots. And it's about thinking in 3D. So again, it's just a quick way, because people might find, biases or blind spots or deaf spots too hard to grasp. But I think anyone can get a trilogy of error. Just try and think of all of those and see, are you at risk against them?
Yeah, and a link to that, what I wanted to ask you about, you also, in the book, when you're talking about deaf spots, mentioning this concept of unintentional deafness. But I wanted to ask you, what's your take on sort of intentional deafness? And what I mean by that is it's started to become really clear to me, like I was going to say over the past few years, but it's much longer than that, really. Having sat in kind of countless meetings when I worked in the corporate sector, and now sort of doing my work in terms of leadership and team development, I might kind of sit in and observe lots of meetings with clients or whatever. And I don't know whether this is intentional or unintentional sort of deafness, but I notice more and more that people choose to hear comments, data points, whatever you want to call it, that supports their position or their argument, and they choose to sort of block out all the stuff that doesn't. So, like, is that intentional? Is that unintentional? Is that deliberate, sort of selective listening? Like, what's your take on that? And are there any tips for overcoming it?
You've actually made two really good points there. Your point about that people choose to block out certain information in meetings to support their arguments is actually confirmation bias. And that is a, that's a blind spot or a deaf spot, because they only hear what they want. A lot of people do that unconsciously. If I said to you, now, Ben, do you know that you're suffering from confirmation bias? You just go, huh? But if I asked you what your favorite sports team was, and then gave you all these reasons as to why they were great, you would only pick out the reasons that you agreed with. If I gave you a counter argument about why they were awful, of course you wouldn't hear a word of it. So that's confirmation bias. You only pick up what you want to hear. But your question about intentional deafness plays directly to a full chapter in the book, which is what I consider the ethical misjudgment traps. Because if you are intentionally doing that, and in a business situation, or indeed any situation, if you're a judge or whoever, you are actually sort of entering into that slippery slope. So, for example, intentional deafness is when, let's just say, the rogue traders. So the rogue traders, Nick Leeson or Jerome Curviel from SocGen, they were very consciously not listening to the instructions from compliance or the advice from their managers or whatever. Ponzi schemes. So if you look at Bernie Madoff, his wasn't unintentional. He didn't accidentally create a Ponzi scheme for £65 billion. He started really small and he fell down the slippery slope. So the ethical, I think exactly what you're saying, when it becomes intentional versus unintentional, you're sort of bordering into the voice of conscience, or the voice of wrongdoing in this case, for the ethical traps. And maybe just to give one example, in the book I mentioned Barclays CEO Jess Staley. He caught my attention when I was doing some whistleblowing research at the London School of Economics. And I think it was 2018 or so, the regulators fined him nearly a million pounds, I think it was, for a conflict of interest because he basically hunted down a whistleblower who had complained about a friend on the board. Now, was that intentional or unintentional? It had to be intentional. He didn't accidentally say, go find the whistleblower. So that was intentional. So what I would say would be unintentional was the consequence. I'm thinking he probably didn't think about the consequences. So he, by definition, fell into other traps there after when he did it, not thinking about the consequences. Maybe it's because of ego, maybe it's because his risk calculation, he downgraded in his head the risk of getting caught. He was the CEO, and no one's going to hold me to account. But then, actually, ironically, I don't know if you remember this, but 3 years later, he resigned when regulators found him guilty of his relationship with Epstein. I think he mischaracterized the relationship rather, and this was after a 30-year career in JP Morgan when he ran a huge business. But compliance had placed red flags against Epstein, following the charges. But the problem there is that Staley vouched for Epstein. So what did he hear? Did Staley, because they were friends or professional colleagues or whatever, or they had a professional relationship, he vouched for him, despite compliance saying, here, there are red flags against this guy, despite him knowing the consequences of that in a wealth management environment. So to my mind, I don't think he did know about what was going on, and that's what he says. I mean, I don't know, but that's my assumption. So that's a combination, I think, of intentional deafness, if you like, and unintentional, sort of wrapped up in the one situation. So it can be both. So you can start with unconscious, and then you lead on to some conscious decision making. So you'll find throughout this book that it's not simple, and human behavior isn't. But human behavior typically wants to break everything down into a very simple nugget, or give me the simple answer to hundreds of years of research. It sometimes just isn't that easy.
And I guess that almost brings us full circle already and speaks to the challenge, right? In a very busy, fast-paced, noisy world, we want that simple, easy to understand soundbite, and often it doesn't exist, does it? We need to, with many things, give ourselves the chance to think, process what it is that we're trying to make sense of, or the decision we're trying to make. It's why I talk a lot about the need to slow down, to speed up. And again, actually from a neuroscience perspective, and how important it is, especially for leaders, but for all of us, to try and somehow build in time to our schedule where we can just do that reflection and processing, because just going for the soundbite or the headline can be really dangerous, can't it? And I'm leaping around here a bit, but so often you'll hear senior leaders say, just give me the headlines, just give me the headlines. And in doing that, you're missing a lot of the detail, and you're almost creating deaf spots for yourself, it seems.
That's a great way to put it, actually. And you're absolutely right. They don't have time. And their error in many cases is they rely on whatever their team are telling them. And most teams just tell them whatever they want to hear because they want to get paid and they want to get promoted. So, are they doing it intentionally? Well, probably not. But they probably selectively give the information. No one wants to be the bearer of the bad news.
Yeah.
And there's actually quite a price to pay for it when you are. Again, people probably don't realize that either. They think they're doing the right thing by speaking up and, telling the boss how it really is. The boss might invite you to do so, but very few of them really want to be told. Some do, of course, but, in many cases they don't.
Yeah.
So people need to judge that situation. But you're absolutely right. Leaders just want the headline. So the lesson for them is, really ask, why am I being told this? Is there a counter argument here? What am I not hearing? What is this person not telling me? That's their responsibility, not to just take whatever they're told because it's easy and it suits their preference or their preconceived notion, which is in many cases exactly what they're doing.
And as you said, that in itself is hard, right? That's a big habit to try and change, isn't it? Because without, it's the title of Marshall Goldsmith's book, right? Like, what got you here won't get you there. Often that rapid decision making is what's got somebody promoted, but suddenly when you find yourself being the CEO or MD of a very large organization, you do need to work harder, I think, don't you, to make sure you are hearing the full picture, because often the more senior you become, people just want to give you the good news, or as you said, people don't want to be the bearer of bad news. So actually, for leaders to be able to really find out what's going on and find out what people are holding back from telling them, like, takes effort, and it's a different skill set, isn't it?
It is a different skill set, but it's also a choice. And another complication is the fact that we just simplify life and information by relying on either the messenger, the person who's telling you the information, or the data and how it's presented. So we trust images, as we know, rather than taking the time to interpret the words, that we hear. So again, that whole messenger effect, who's telling you this information and why? Even if you start with that, who's telling me this, and why? And am I really listening to the maverick voice or the minority voice? Are they even at the table? And in many cases they aren't. So I think the more evolved leaders know this, and I consciously try and do that. And I guess they realize that, look, that interpretation is, it's a small step in theory, but of course, it's a giant leap in many other respects in practical terms. So
Yeah.
there is a responsibility on the leader to get that right, and I think that's the onus, and that's the choice that people are facing now. So misjudgment, it may not be their fault in a crazy world of misinformation and disinformation, but better judgment is a choice, and you choose to do it, and you choose to spend some time at least understanding other people's agendas as well. So it's not just about reinterpreting, data on a slide. It's about what's really going on. And Toyota have this great, and it's just one of the recommendations that is the Toyota approach, which is called the 5 whys. And all they do is ask 5 questions that dig down into a deeper level. So you might say, well, why do you do X? Well, I do it because of this. And why do you do that? Well, I do it because of A, B, and C. And you just keep going down, down, and you drill all the way down 5 times. And the idea is that you solve a technical problem with a human problem, because at the end of the day, it's about, well, I didn't want to do it, or I wasn't able to do it, or I didn't feel I could do it. Any of these sort of behavioral reasons, which typically underpin a business problem, and in every case, a business problem can be redefined in terms of a behavioral problem, but that's not always accepted or appreciated in business, unfortunately.
And a few minutes ago, Nuala, you mentioned visual, what we see, the visual system. And again, I read how you said sort of almost the world we live in seems to put more emphasis on what we see in the visual system. And I love the fact that early on in the book, you referenced the story that I'd heard before, a few people might have, but is it Joshua Bell, the world-renowned violinist who was in I think a Washington subway playing a piece of Bach music, and nearly everybody just walked past him. Like, quite often you see the story relayed on LinkedIn. Like, I find that whole story and sort of experiment, if it was set up as an experiment, really interesting. I think, well, if I was walking through that subway, would I have stopped to appreciate what I was hearing? And I don't know if I would. Like, if I was busy in a rush heading towards a meeting, there's some context why I perhaps wouldn't have stopped. But then I haven't got an ear for classical music. So whilst I might have thought that sounds really good, I wouldn't have been able to tune in and tell the difference between a good violinist and the world's best violinist. But I can just talk a little more, Nuala, to the power of the visual system's place in a noisy world.
It's a really good point, Ben, because you're absolutely right. It's easy to jump to the conclusion that nobody listened to him just because he wasn't dressed and he wasn't playing in, the Boston Symphony, hall or wherever it was, and nobody likes classical music. But there's another thing there that might, of course, be true. And if there were over 1,000 or 1,100 employees who passed him by over that time, most people don't look at people when they're busy. Not everybody there wouldn't have liked classical music, but I think 7 people stopped. So if you look at that even as a percentage, 7 out of 1,097, it's not that many. I'm sure more people than that. I mean, classical music isn't that unpopular that nobody would stop. But if you see someone, you might assume that they were a down and out, or just trying to eke out, or a busker. I mean, I don't know, but I don't typically. You're right. I don't. Would I stop at a bus? Would I stop at what I think is a busker? I probably only would if I liked the song, and if I was in a hurry, I wouldn't. But I might appreciate it. I might stop for a minute and throw something in if I really liked it, but only had a little waft of it going past in a hurry. So the study serves a couple of points. It serves at an exaggerated level to make the point that we rely on what we see, not what we hear. And it's despite whatever interest you have, but you're not wrong. It, of course, is complicated by, motivated reasoning, interests, and preferences. But there is a point there that we judge a book by its cover and we see what we want to see. And further on in the chapter, you might recall that there was another example of an 82-year-old art critic who basically saw this Vermeer painting, and he's an art critic, and he failed basically to spot that it was a forgery. Now, if you're 82 and an art critic, you're supposed to know what's a forgery and what isn't, allegedly. So he was so keen and, so blown away at finding this, I think it was a Christ at a Moss painting, that he basically gave it a thumbs up, and it was sold for millions. So he failed to ask some fundamental questions. So at the time, Vermeer had his work was rare. So how come in the space of a couple of years at the time, there were so many Vermeer paintings suddenly on the market? So that's even the most obvious question. You don't see one in 20 years and then suddenly see 5. Surely there's something a little bit astray there. No, I've seen one. Isn't it amazing? Because you want to see it. So if you get to 82 and you've never seen one and it's your life's work, that point was made because we see what we want to see. And our over-reliance on visual data is absolutely pervasive. I mean, whether it's true or not, people still swear that they see the statue of the Virgin Mary crying. Did they? Well, I don't know, but I would say no, but maybe they did, but they say they saw it. And, people see what they want to see. So, I gave another example of Piers Morgan, who, was duped and reasonably duped by pictures. There were fake pictures of, British soldiers, abusing some Iraqi prisoners. But was it that he just wanted a headline? Well, I'm sure he wasn't that desperate only for a headline, but he saw it and believed it. And I think Arthur Conan Doyle saw pictures of fairies as well and was convinced that they were real. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle is a very good author. He wrote Sherlock Holmes. So I know he's got an imagination, but I doubt he really believes in fairies. And it was just 2 girls dressed up as fairies. So we see what we want to see when it fits whatever we're doing. And because we are so dominated by, visuals in an Instagram world, there's a lesser focus on what we hear. And I think that's the point. So that's exactly what I think that Joshua Bell example sets out to portray.
Yeah, makes sense. Nuala, 2 final questions to ask you to wrap up. One wasn't on my original question list to ask you, but as I say, as I was reading and enjoying the book, there was something early on that I read that really stuck out because it's particularly relevant to where we are in the UK right now and the US. And it's really about your point of sort of how to tune in and hear the right voices. And I normally steer clear of this, but in the UK, we're heading towards an election at some stage this year. The US is heading in the same way. With all that kind of, for your experience and your research in particular, writing this book, like how in the run up to an election can we make sure we are hearing the right voices in inverted comma, and the stuff that we are hearing is as close to fact as anything can possibly be, whatever a fact might be, right? Without getting too much into the nuance of that. But like, what advice have you got there? Because it seems that right now in the world, the ability for us to choose good world leaders and have good leaders at the top of our biggest institutions, to me, feels more important than ever.
You're not wrong, and I certainly wouldn't opine on which person was the right voice. However, I will very clearly point to the wrong voice, and then by definition, it is a process of elimination in your mind in terms of what you want.
Okay, nice.
So for me, the wrong voices, and again, these are in theory, so you work it out. The familiar voice. So if you voted for the same person for the last 10 years or the same party for the last 10 years, you've never questioned that party. You've never questioned their politics or their statements or anything else. Well, that to me is a red flag. Why wouldn't you? It's like, why wouldn't you at least consider that there might be something that maybe this time they're not right? So Just doing it from habit or from because my father did it or my mother did it is the wrong thing. So the familiarity of the party or the person, I think, really matters. And the familiarity also goes to the habit. So this habit-based decision in any format, I think, is really, really important. The other thing is, who are you not hearing? Ask yourself what needs to be true to make the other party, whoever it is, to make them right. If you have formed an opinion that party X is the right voice and party Y is completely wrong, you're actually being very binary in your thinking. It's most unlikely that one is 100% right and the other one's 100% wrong. So there is always something in the other party's view, always, even the people we don't like. So we don't like them, and we have lots of people in our world that we don't like. But you know what? There's always something in whatever they're saying. So I try to listen to whatever that counter argument. And, Bill Clinton was a master politician, as we know, and he always took the other person's argument. Now, in order to understand it, there's another point of view that the more you hear about the other side, the more you dig in and you entrench and you won't shift your views. But not even at least having an open mind to accept the point of view that you might be wrong. So I do have in some of the recommendations what I call the default to error. So interrupt yourself, interrupt your thinking, apply that slow decision making so that you interrupt your thinking and the people around you as well. Because if you just suddenly rush to, I've always voted for X has got a great story. And then I would also very consciously use what I call the story-based traps. Politicians are masters. They are masters at constructing what emotion is being triggered in you, because they are triggering something to make you vote. So it's either fear or hope. And just break that down and know that it's a game and you are a pawn in the game. Whether you're a customer or a voter or whoever, or a juror, you are being triggered by any of these emotions. And I would be very circumspect now to think, oh, what are they making me, they want me to act. How are they? And because it is control, it is manipulation. And if you're not even aware that those, by the way they speak, the sequence of the wording, it's something called the mere repetition effect, the illusory truth effect. If you're not even aware of these, they've got you basically. So your point about then by definition, you aren't even asking which is the right voice. You've decided early and you've decided prematurely. So I guess any of those techniques then I think would at least raise a red flag in your mind to be very, very careful.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the interruption one, actually, because that's a section of the book I skim read, and that jumped out at me, and it's triggered an interesting thought in me. And it's to do this is quite un-British. It might be slightly more comfortable for other nationalities and cultures, but typically when politicians are canvassing in the run up to election here in the UK and England, at least, one of the typical lines is, "Can I count on your vote at the election?" And that's whether they're knocking on your door or grabbing you on the street as you're trying to go about your business. But it strikes me a really good response is no, but talk to me about it, but convince me, but just default to, well, no, you can't rely on it, but I'm open to listening to what every party has got to say, and then I can use some judgment to try and make up my own mind.
Do you know that's an excellent point, because in actual fact, you know what they're doing when they ask that question? They're doing a couple of things. They're relying on your consistency, because if you say yes,
Commitment
I
and
can count on you,
consistency.
exactly. Yeah. And we all like to be nice people. Oh well, I said I'd do it. Oh, I must do it.
Yeah.
And then they're leading you to the hall. Oh, where will you be? What will you be wearing when you do that? And you're visualizing yourself walking into that polling station. So when it comes to the time, you think, oh yeah, so in your head you've already been down there. You've probably ticked the box. So
Yeah.
as I said, it's very clever. I mean, there are strategies that are used. So as a behavioural scientist, I use these. I personally don't use them, but my colleagues use them, and I've read all about them in terms of how you actually manipulate voting to get voters to turn up and actually not to vote for A or B, but which is a different discussion, but to actually get there in the first place. So just like retailers, play the French wine to get you to play French music to get you to play the French wine. These politicians are masters, and they've got teams behind them, dragging you out on a rainy night to bring you down to that polling station. And if you do it, they've won.
It reminds me, several years ago, I dropped my wife's car into a garage to be serviced, and as I was picking it up, the guy said to me, "Oh, you'll get a email direct from head office in the next couple of hours or so with some feedback. Is there any reason you couldn't score us a 5 out of 5, sir?" And I went, That's interesting. I said, have you been on a training course recently? And had a really interesting chat with the guy, because he's giving me an embedded command, right? He's effectively subliminally telling me to score him a 5 out of 5. We ended up having a really interesting chat, nothing to do with the car, but all about sort of languaging and messaging. But so often we don't realize how we're being influenced, right?
You're absolutely right. He primed you. And let me ask you, Ben, did you give him the 5?
No, I gave him a 4, actually.
Did you?
If he hadn't have asked me, I probably would have given him a 5.
Would you? Yes, you felt you were being manipulated, you see.
I did, yeah, exactly, because I knew what he was doing. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Nuala, one final question to finish up. If you could leave our listeners with just one practical, high-impact piece of advice to help them make better decisions in this noisy world that you talk about in your book, what would it be and why?
I'm going to disappoint you now, Ben, because I'm going to say there isn't only one. My one, is cumulative, because I'm actually going to refer them to the book, and I'll tell you why. Because it contains 75 different biases and 10 traps. And if people familiarize themselves with only that and read that, there are lots of good stories. So if they read that, to be fair, you do 2 things. You prevent future error in the moment, because you're now conscious of it, and you are able to analyze why you made mistakes in the past, and by definition, hopefully learn from those. So if you do that, by definition, I think it's a fast track to making better decisions. And if you can't make a decision, I would actually, and you suffer from indecision, I would probably also self-promote and refer people to my TEDx talk, which is all about how to overcome indecision. And I think that is a very, very simple way to help people make decisions. And so far, I must say, people have been very kind. It seems to really help people. 16 minutes, if you can't decide, I kind of think you'll probably decide after that, because it just tells you why you can't and how to do it.
Brilliant. Nuala, what I will do for everybody listening, because as I say, I'm really enjoying the book and I enjoyed your TED Talk, which I have watched, I will stick the links to both of those things in the show notes. So if you're listening, you want to check those out, then just head to the show notes, folks, and the links are there so you don't have to go hunting. Nuala, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. We could quite easily have spent another 45 minutes chatting, because there is just so much value in that book. So thank you for coming on the show and sharing just a little bit of your expertise with us. Thank you very much.
Not at all, Ben. And thank you for some excellent questions.
My pleasure. So that's it, folks. That was my conversation with Nuala Walsh. I really hope you enjoyed listening as much as Nuala and I enjoyed recording it for you. And I would love to know which bits from that episode really resonated with you. And were there any bits that perhaps jarred with you or felt a little bit uncomfortable? How did you feel when you realised that you might have some deaf, dumb and blind spots lurking in your leadership closet, so to speak? Do also remember, if effective decision making and creating the conditions where people willingly follow you as a leader is something that resonates with you, then do drop me a line via chat@ben-morton.com and let's have a conversation around how I might be able to come and give a keynote presentation to your audience, deliver some leadership training, or even provide some one-to-one coaching for you and your colleagues. I'd love to be of service. And before you go, if you've got a couple of minutes to spare and I can ask just one more thing of you, it would be amazing if you could leave a quick rating and review of the show and then hit the follow button on whichever platform you happen to be listening to the show on. That is it for this episode, though. Until next time, look after yourself, look after those people you've got the privilege and responsibility to lead. And as always, lead on.